Welcome to Thinking Green. I'm Rana, and tonight we're going to talk about fracking for like 50 minutes. I have two guests tonight. Gary Bent, who was the head of the physics department at UConn and also taught high school science, and is currently involved in Eastern Connecticut Green Action. And Jennifer Siskind, who is from Food and Water Watch, where she's the Connecticut local coordinator. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Roni.
I guess before we really get into the details of fracking, maybe each of you can talk briefly about how your respective organizations became involved in the issue.
Food and Water Watch is a consumer advocacy organization. We're national and international. We have our home offices in Washington, D.C., and about 17 offices around the country. And we became concerned over 10 years ago that fracking was going to be contributing to contamination of our water supply. And we were one of the first national organizations to come right out and call for a ban on fracking. And I became involved because I have family members and I'm frequently visiting them in Pennsylvania where fracking is very active. And I live here in Connecticut, and my concern became whether the waste from fracking from Pennsylvania is going to be imported into our state in the near future. So I've been very active here in the state, trying to give as many public presentations, trying to educate the public that this waste is going to be an issue. And Gary and I met, and he and I have worked together for over the past year, and it's always a pleasure to be with him again.
And likewise.
Well, now Gary, Eastern Connecticut Green Action is a relatively new grassroots group. Correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we're local. We're not national in any sense.
So what was the motivation for creating this grassroots presence?
Well, there was a bunch of us who went to a interreligious eco-justice network workshop. And afterwards we were talking about we ought to do something about global warming and climate change and stop burning fossil fuels. And we were all from Eastern Connecticut. At lunch, we were sitting around, and we decided to get together and try to do something. So we started about December 2014, and what really got us off the ground was that Jen came and gave a presentation on fracking waste, and Martha Klein from the Connecticut Sierra Club came and gave a presentation about natural gas and the expansion of the gas lines. And we were able to draw quite a few people from Eastern Connecticut to that. And that was really the start off of our group.
So you're centered more in the like Willimantic and Mansfield area, but you know, everyone out there, you know, New London is Eastern Connecticut too. So what impacts, you know, the towns a little bit to the north of us can certainly impact us as well.
Well, yes.
And there's always room for expansion.
Yeah.
And actually, climate change impacts everybody.
Yeah.
And especially does.
Especially shoreline communities.
Yes, and New London could really be severely impacted. Mm-hmm. Well, I think we can start out by just presenting some background information about fracking. I'm not sure that everyone who's watching, we do have natural gas piped into most of our homes in New London, but I don't think we have given a lot of thought to where gas is coming
where it comes from,
and where it came from traditionally and what's happening now.
Sure. Well, I have some slides. If we could pull
that
up,
sounds great.
Pull up the first one. I don't know if this is there. It is. So what you're seeing on this slide is a map of the United States that shows all the areas where we're currently trying to retrieve gas from shale rock and oil from shale rock is this map. And traditionally, Connecticut received its gas from the Gulf states, from the Louisiana area, traveled all the way up through pipelines to Connecticut. About 10 years ago, there was an expansion of a new type of technology that was used to start drilling for oil and gas. And you can see the large orange section up on the right of the screen. That's the Marcellus Shale deposit. And that is considered the Saudi Arabia of the Northeast. And in just 10 years or so, more than 9,500 new gas wells have been drilled in that state.
So it's easy to see how Pennsylvania was tremendously impacted.
Tremendously impacted. About 3/4 of the state has drillable areas. And so what you're seeing is a map of all the shale deposits as they would exist underground, but what's happening is anywhere that shale exists underground, leases are being sold either on public land or on private land, and the drilling is coming right up against where people are living and working and playing. Here you're seeing a photo where a school department has leased their land right next to a high school. Land is being leased in neighbors' backyards by neighboring properties. Out in the countryside, a lot of farmland as well is also being leased. And what you're seeing here is a typical well site. You see the well pad, you see sticking up into the ground, out of the ground, the red and white structure that's called a derrick. That's what they're actually using to drill the well with. And associated with this whole well pad is waste pits, either temporary waste pits because waste will come back out of the well, or there's also the containment pond. You can see an additional drilling site off in the distance. So right now the gas coming into Connecticut, maybe about 50% of it is coming out of Pennsylvania right now, and it's due to be about 90% in the next coming years as gas gets expanded.
Now I see the derricks. How deep do they have to drill for this gas?
The shale deposit is over 1 mile deep in the ground, and the difference is because we're drilling so deep, and this new horizontal hydrofracking, you drill down 1 mile deep, then they're able to turn the drill bit horizontally and continue another mile or more through the shale. And because they have to drill so far, they are injecting a much higher volume of fluid into that well at a very high pressure to break up the shale underground. They're breaking it up, or they're fracturing the shale. And then once it's broken up, the gas can be released. But unfortunately, what they're injecting into the ground is a high volume of water, highly toxic chemicals, and sand. And much of that returns to the surface and becomes waste. So we've got a couple examples. When they're actually drilling, they need to use drilling fluids to help alleviate the drilling process. And that fluid or mud returns to the surface and becomes waste. What they've actually drilled out of the ground is they're called drill cuttings. It's the soil and rock that's coming to the surface. That's a type of solid waste. This high volume of injected fluid, each well typically takes about 4 to 5 million gallons of this slick water solution. When it flows back to the surface, it's called flowback waste. It's housed in temporary containment ponds. You can see here in this picture where the man-made swimming pool, the lining is slipping, and the chemicals and contaminants that are in that can penetrate through the soil and end up into shallow aquifers and contaminate water that way. Here's another example of waste being spilled at a drill site. And then in addition to all the chemicals that come back up to the surface, when the gas returns to the surface, it's much different than what happens when you turn on your stove or turn on your, your gas burner or your fireplace. It has to be processed before it's in that condition. And when it comes to the surface, it's mixed with a brine material that naturally exists in the shale. The shale was formed by ancient seabeds. And 350 million years ago, this shale was an ocean, a shallow seabed, and so that ancient seawater is also trapped in the rock. And as the gas returns to the surface to the well, it has to be processed, and then this brine is another type of waste that needs to be disposed of. And unfortunately, it's all chemically toxic. Yale did a study recently that they examined about 1,000 chemicals, 1,021 to be exact, that we now know of that are being reported. There's many chemicals that are kept as proprietary secrets, and we don't know about them. But a number of years ago, back in 2011, a very well-known endocrinologist, Dr. Theo Colburn, when she was studying back then, she found about 650 chemicals. She tried to research these specific numbers that are assigned to each chemical, if there's scientific research that's been done about them. And then she went and looked up all these chemicals to see what they could do to the human body. And this infographic that was produced by Physicians for Responsibility, Social Responsibility, shows what she found in her research. Many of these chemicals are soluble in water. You see that in blue. The red is volatile. That means they can basically vaporize so that they can travel through the air. The percentage of the chemicals that she was able to find research that was done about them, this is the effect on the human body. They can cause severe skin rashes, liver and GI problems, numerous organ damage. They can damage the immune system, the endocrine system, which produces and helps control all the hormones in your body. Neurological damage it can result, cancer, and a number of other issues. And there's been a lot of additional studies that are starting to see an association where people are starting to experience the types of health problems that are associated with what these chemicals can do with the human body.
Now, I'm going to back up and ask a couple of questions just
Sure.
about the drilling process.
Mm-hmm.
For the mile deep and perhaps mile lengthwise drilling that occurs, are those wells, is there a barrier between those wells and the soil and the aquifers they're going through?
There is what's called a well casing at the top of the well. However, those casings can not be installed correctly. They can crack, they can be absent in areas, they can develop pockets if the cement isn't pumped in correctly. And researchers who have been active in the field of drilling, particularly Dr. Tony Ingraffia from Cornell University, information that comes out from the drilling industry have shown that about 6%, 6 to 8% of wells that are drilled, those casings can fail almost immediately within the first year. And then as these wells age, year after year, the percentage of failure of that casing continues to progress. So there is some protection that can be offered, but there can certainly also be plenty of problems where the casing is in some way damaged and aquifers can become contaminated.
It seems to me, I think about 2 or 3 years ago, our Peace and Justice Network showed the movie Gasland,
Mm-hmm.
and I seem to recall that the flaws in the casing were one of the big issues that people were dealing with the effects of.
Yeah.
And you look like you're ready to want to say something.
Not necessarily.
Jump in anytime, Gary.
Yeah. I have nothing specific to add what Jim has said, except I'm sure she's going to mention radioactivity coming up from the ground.
Yeah. That's actually our very next slide. So good segue. Let's move into that. It comes from a report by Dr. E. Ivan White. He's a senior staff member at a national organization and that studies radiation. And in this particular slide, you're seeing the difference between conventional vertical wells and these horizontal gas wells. And the conventional wells can still be fracked, they can be hydrofracked, but because they go directly down into the shale and they have very little surface area in the shale that they have to impact, the amount of liquid that's pumped into them is a much smaller amount, on average maybe 80,000 gallons per well. So the amount of waste that returns to the surface then is also very small. And with these horizontal gas wells, as we mentioned, they go down vertically and then they turn and can move more than a mile through the shale. And the shale deposit is highly radioactive, and the Marcellus shale deposit in Pennsylvania is known to be more radioactive than other shales around the country. So when you're drilling through it at such a long distance and sending this liquid material into it over a far distance, the total contact with all this radioactive shale is much greater. So that impacts the waste that's coming to the surface. It has the potential to have a much higher degree of radioactivity than some of the vertical wells. And the radioactivity that we're seeing is primarily radium-226 and radium-228.
Now, at what point did the technology change to where the horizontal wells became more the norm?
Well, the method was perfected in the 1990s. A Energy Policy Act was passed in Congress in 2005, which exempted the oil and gas industry from the Safe Drinking Water Act.
That does not sound like a good
idea. It's not a good idea. It's kind of nicknamed the Halliburton loophole. And once the oil and gas industry was able to lobby through Congress and get this exemption, that's when fracking really took off in about 2005 in various parts of the country. And since then, it's just expanded exponentially, and that's why we're producing billions and billions of gallons of waste and hundreds and thousands of tons of solid waste. That's being shipped all around the country, and Connecticut may be next. And the radioactivity is a particular problem because it can migrate through the air. This next slide kind of shows an example of that. The radioactive isotopes can enter the air, and then through the air you can have, starting from the top, you can be directly exposed to the radiation. It can deposit on crops or plants, so then when humans eat those crops or plants, they can be ingesting the radiation.
So it's not quite Chernobyl, but it's not that different in effect.
It can deposit on soil. If you come in contact with the soil, you're exposed to it. You can inhale it. Animals also can inhale it, and then when we eat animal products, either dairy or meats, these are all ways that the human body can be impacted by this radioactive material.
Now, what's the half-life of those radium isotopes that are prevalent?
Radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years. So 1,600 years is how much time it takes for half of the radioactivity to decay. And then as it's decaying, it also turns into additional daughter elements such as lead and polonium. And then those decayed materials hang around for a considerable amount of time too.
So we're talking multiple lifetimes of centuries of generations.
We are, and in addition to traveling through the air, radioactive material can also travel through soil and water. And we're already seeing radioactive water contamination in areas where this is being discharged into waterways from treatment centers, treatment facilities. And we're talking about a significant amount of radioactive material. Radium has actually three types of radioactivity. It has gamma radiation, but it also has alpha and beta radiation. And when you combine these total radioactive levels, you can see in this next graph, the safe drinking water is 5 picocuries per liter. A picocurie is named after Madame Curie, who discovered radium. She also died from radium poisoning after handling it in her lab. And 5 picocuries per liter is the safe level for drinking water. The safe level for it to be discharged is about 60 picocuries per liter. And you can see from this graph that there are measurements that are exceeding into hundreds and thousands and over 10,000 picocuries per liter. I think the highest measurement I've seen is 26,000 picocuries per liter. So it's a significant amount of radiation. And these chemical contaminants and this radioactive material, unfortunately, is going into tanker trucks that are traveling in numerous states, over 24 states. We're having many more accidents on the roadways.
If I may interject.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one part of the Halliburton loophole that was passed was that any product from oil and gas exploration or production cannot be labeled as hazardous waste. So all these trucks carrying these chemically contaminated and radioactive contaminated waste are not labeled hazardous waste at all.
Right, right. So, and that also impacts where this waste gets disposed of. Even though it may be hazardous if you were any other industry, the oil and gas industry has been able to exempt themselves, as Gary has mentioned, and so how it's being disposed of, state by state, can differ. And what we'll see in the next slide is where Pennsylvania is sending a lot of their waste. This particular map comes off of a website that people watching can go visit. It's called Fracking. I have added in the material that's on the right side of the page in the text boxes. And Pennsylvania is currently sending their hazardous waste to 8 different states. Over the border in Pennsylvania, it's going to solid waste facilities or
So
landfills.
is it mostly a sludgy material?
It can be this, well, the solid drilled cuttings that we showed in one of those early pictures. It could be sludge that's left over in the bottom of tanks and these, man-made ponds. They try to siphon off a lot of the liquid and recycle it, either on site with these mobile recycling trucks or sending it to a centralized facility, like a treatment facility. And at either of those sites, they're not able to 100% remove all the contaminants from this water. It's still, when they recycle it and use it over and over again at various drilling sites, it's still contaminated when it arrives at that new drilling site to be used again.
So each iteration, it's potentially more contaminated.
It becomes more and more contaminated. Yeah, and there becomes a point in time where it's just too contaminated to use anymore, and drillers will often send it off for disposal at that point in time. And you can see on these flags, the yellow flags, where a lot of it is going to injection wells in Ohio. Some of it's going to industrial wastewater treatment plants. Some of it's going to landfills. The highly radioactive material that's set off triggers by Geiger counters as it comes into a landfill is turned back, and instead that very highly radioactive material is sent all the way across the country, I think to Utah and possibly Nevada, where there are specialized radioactive landfills.
Now, is it trucked or does it go by rail, or how is it traveling?
I believe it can go by both. I'm most familiar with it traveling by truck, but rail is certainly a possibility. And our issue for Connecticut is that we tried to pass a ban in Connecticut to prevent this waste from coming into our state. And unfortunately, we weren't able to get a statewide ban passed. Instead, we have a temporary moratorium right now in Connecticut. And as early as July 2017, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection is mandated to submit regulations on how we're going to deal with fracking waste in Connecticut. And I'll show you in this next slide, when New York State found out that waste was coming from Pennsylvania and that they were threatened with drilling in their state, all the little colored areas, the yellow, the pink, and the red, were individual towns that passed local ordinances banning both drilling and the disposal or use of waste in their towns. In addition to all these individual towns, New York has a level of government that we don't have in Connecticut. They have county government. And those counties that you see, the overlay, the transparent red, about 17 counties got involved in New York and started passing a county-wide waste ban. And these county-wide bans have now protected more than 500 municipalities in New York State from fracking waste. And you can see the state of Vermont has passed a ban statewide on both drilling and on accepting fracking waste into the state. But here in Connecticut, we have a temporary moratorium that will expire, and DEEP is currently reviewing how to write regulations to bring waste to Connecticut for disposal. And what we are trying to encourage through this education process is for town governments and town citizens to get involved and start passing waste bans in their state, in their area. We have 3 in the state so far. Washington, Connecticut took the lead and passed the first ban in the state of Connecticut about a year ago.
And they're right on the New York border.
They're over in Litchfield County. Yeah, they're relatively close to where waste could come close to Connecticut. Then Coventry, Connecticut was next, and Mansfield was the 3rd town to pass a waste ban. But Gary was very active in his town.
Was it a tough sell?
Well, so let me back up a minute and say that first of all those areas of New York State you saw where they had the bans, there's a lot of areas where they don't. And last year New York had 500,000 tons of fracking waste that was disposed of in New York State.
So if you're not in a place that's being kept relatively safe, you're really in a bad way.
Right, and what we're hoping for in Connecticut is for a statewide ban on fracking waste. And so one of the things the organization I belong to, Eastern Connecticut Green Action, has been promoting is for local towns to pass ordinances banning fracking waste. So our organization in Coventry passed one, and Mansfield had passed one. It was easier in Mansfield than it was in Coventry to pass it. And one of the reasons is that each town has its own charter. Yeah. And you have to go to your town government, find out what the charter is, how do you petition to pass an ordinance, and it's going to differ from town to town.
Yes, and there are 169 towns.
Right.
So, and they are truly all different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right, but almost all of them have in common is that if you're going to do a petition to pass a fracking waste ordinance, to get your town council to do this, it can only be done by registered voters in the town, and you can only sign up registered voters in the town. So you need a local organization, town organization, 4 or 5 people would be a nice nucleus, to try to promote a fracking waste ordinance in the town.
But the first step I'm thinking is for people who are interested in doing this in their own towns is to see what avenue their charter presents. And I think, like last month perhaps, I looked at the New London charter, and New London is not an easy town to petition for an ordinance. Mm-hmm. People petition all the time, but it's in response to council actions. It isn't just a citizen initiative. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure New London will be one of the first ones, but I wonder if some of the surrounding towns like, Waterford, East Lyme, Montville, Groton might have totally different, systems of government and might be able to go over much more easily.
Yeah, I think our URLs for our organizations are up. So anybody in a town who's interested in trying to promote a ordinance to ban fracking waste, they should contact either myself via Eastern Connecticut Green Action or Jen versus Food and Water Watch.
So yeah, that is a good action plan because, in fact, that's one of the points of this TV show that we've had for so many years, that, we want people to know how to take action.
Right, right. And here in Connecticut, we've really had 3 separate ways that ordinances have been passed locally. Out in Washington, they have an environmental organization, the Washington Environmental Council, which is a nonprofit that's been active for many decades. And the leaders of that organization have a lot of clout. They're really considered VIPs in their area. And the executive director of that organization went to his local selectmen and said, look, the state just failed to pass a statewide ban. We have to do something to protect ourselves. And there was such good collaboration between the city government in Washington and this nonprofit that they fully supported. They said to the executive director, go ahead, write up the ordinance. We trust you, write it up. We'll have it reviewed by our town lawyer. And then we'll hold a special town meeting and get a vote for it. So there was a lot of support within the town. The Conservation Commission reviewed it. They came on board within about 2 months' time. Over a course of basically 2 monthly meetings. They signed on, and citizens came to the special town meeting and they unanimously voted to pass their ordinance. In Coventry, they took a little bit of a different route. They looked at their charter, and their charter allowed citizens to petition directly for an ordinance, and that was the route that they decided to go. So they went out and collected 3% of the registered voters' signatures, and the town council was required to hold a public meeting. And Coventry is a very small town, but this is something that people are highly passionate about. Here's a picture of the vote taking place last October. They had more than 90 people show up at this special town meeting, and it was almost 100% unanimous, this vote for this. So, when council members, as they were in Washington and in Mansfield, when they're given an opportunity to champion this, when they understand the degree of risk that they're going to put their town, both the natural resources, the water supply, the local soil, the health and safety of their residents. This is an issue for town leaders to really champion around, and you can see the popularity with local citizenry in getting this passed. So this is really a terrific opportunity for political leaders to show how much they care for their community.
And I like those two examples because they showed two very different ways to get to the goal.
And I can talk in some detail about what we did in Mansfield.
Okay.
So in Mansfield, we went to our Conservation Commission and talked to them about passing an ordinance that we wanted to do this. We went to our Sustainability Committee and talked to them. We went to the Democratic Town Committee and talked to them about passing this, got several questions. And one of our group went to the Republican Town Committee and talked to them about passing this. Then when we had the number of signatures that we could actually force the council to take some sort of action on it, several of us made appointments to talk to our council members one-on-one and talk to them about the ordinance and why we thought it was important, and what questions they had. And I think that helped to make Mansfield pass it unanimously. So it passed unanimously in Mansfield.
Yeah, it was the council members who actually passed it. It didn't go to a town vote.
And I'm thinking a New London process might look very similar to what you did in Mansfield. It would probably have to be something that was passed by the council, but could be championed by the Sustainability Committee or the Conservation Commission or plus individual citizens.
Right.
Now, do you have more slides?
I think that's the last slide. I think while we're getting this changed out,
yeah, I
over
think we'll
some
get
new
things
slides.
changed out a little.
What I can do is, just while we're doing that, I can just mention that you can go ahead and take the computer, and we, in addition to this waste coming to Connecticut to be processed at a hazardous waste treatment facility here in Connecticut, our issue is that waste is being processed and then turned into a secondary product, which is then being sold off to contractors and municipalities to use. And
what are they using it for?
the brine that I mentioned that gets extracted, remember it's ancient seawater. It's about 8 times saltier than normal seawater. So it's used to spread on the roads to de-ice roads. It can also be used to spread in certain areas to control dust. And the solid materials are being marketed to use in construction projects, to use as fill for road construction. Brownfields are areas that have been contaminated by industry decades ago, and they're areas that you can't build on or live on because they're so heavily contaminated. When you try to remediate a brownfield and turn it into something that is usable property, you have to cap it first. And these drill cuttings are, some of them are being sold off as capping material for brownfield projects. And Connecticut is in the process right now of moving forward on numerous brownfield remediation projects around the state. And my concern...
It's kind of like from bad to worse.
It is. So, my concern is that improperly screened materials, which will be deemed not radioactive, but have not been properly tested in a laboratory, every single batch load tested properly, will end up making its way somehow into the state, either for some sort of construction project or for road use, if DEEP writes this into our regulations and if it gets approved.
So, as if this all isn't bad enough, Gary, what are the other impacts of our gas industry?
Yeah, so even if you could do hydraulic fracking safely without contaminating anything,
Which you can't.
which is not the case.
But even
if the industry took enough care, maybe.
No.
But that makes it much more expensive. And so the cheapest way is the way that people go.
There will always be leaks and accidents. So our byline is that it cannot be done safely.
Okay. But natural gas itself increases global warming. And so even if you didn't have the fracking waste problem and the contamination of the wells of people in the locale where they are actually doing the fracking, you would still have the problem that natural gas is a greenhouse gas all by itself. But perhaps maybe what we ought to talk about first is why global warming is such a threat to us.
Okay, and you have slides, right?
Yes, so there's a slide up in the right-hand corner. How do I get to that?
Yep,
Yeah.
it's already showing that one.
Here.
Yep.
Okay, so when I say stop the expansion of natural gas, I'm not talking about taking natural gas away from anybody who has it.
Right.
The gas companies are trying to make a tremendous expansion of transmission pipelines through the state of Connecticut.
Well, it seems like for the past 10 years, it's been really hyped as a great transition fuel. The prices have at times been much lower than oil. And so, yeah, I'm sure there's a plan to expand.
Yes, and there's two types of expansion that's going on in Connecticut. One is the transmission pipelines, which does not provide natural gas to customers. And the other is the distribution pipelines, which connect up to the transmission pipelines. So the state of Connecticut has a plan to add 300,000 more customers on natural gas in the state, which that expansion by itself is going to create problems. But the transmission gas lines, their expansion is another problem. But let's look at the threat from climate change.
Okay, this is,
So how do I get to
that'll
Press it
advance
once.
you.
Yep.
There we go. Yes, so people may have heard of the 2 degrees Celsius limit, that we're not supposed to go beyond 2 degrees Celsius from 1780 to the end of the century. Otherwise, we're going to have catastrophic climate change. And catastrophic depends on what you mean by how far we go beyond 2 degrees Celsius. 3 degrees Celsius, 4 degrees Celsius, it gets worse and worse. We're talking about things like all the glaciers in the Himalayas melting away, and the rivers that India depends on just completely drying up. We're talking about the Brazilian rainforests ceasing to exist. Tremendous changes in our climate, creating refugees all over the place. And of course, we are experiencing this impact all around the world, even the United States right now. So,
And people, even people who are don't want to think about global warming and climate change, have to admit that we've had some pretty strange climate and weather over the last couple years.
yes, we're having a storm of the century about every 10
Yeah.
years now. So the 2 degrees Celsius, that does not sound, we're talking about 4 degrees Fahrenheit. That doesn't sound like a very serious thing because the temperature varies 20 to 30 degrees each day. So one thing I want to point out is that this is the temperature change over the entire Earth over an entire year that we're talking about. So when we talk about the change in temperature can't exceed 2 degrees Celsius, we're talking this average over an entire
Right, we're
year.
not talking about the natural
We're not
ups
talking
and
about the
downs,
day-to-day fluctuation.
seasonally or day and night.
Right. And so this next slide, hopefully will make
Oh, yeah.
the point why this is important. Now, all these different lines are different proxy thermometers that people took temperature from, but the black line is the average. So if people concentrate on the black line, and if they notice the scale at the bottom, they'll notice that it goes from 0 on the right, which means present time, and back to 12,000 years before now. And if they look at the black line, they'll see that at about 10,000 years, the temperature leveled off. And the fluctuations from the average, which is the 0 line here, did not exceed, the vertical scale is the temperature change. It says temperature anomaly, that's just a fancy word for change. So the temperature change for over 10,000 years has not been more than 0.5 degrees Celsius higher than 0 or minus 0.5 degrees lower. So our entire civilization developed in those 10,000 years. And one of the reasons we developed so well is that we had an almost constant temperature, very little changes in 10,000 years. But now,
It's amazing when you look at it that way, that we're talking about a range of a degree
right,
over
1 degree Celsius or about
over
2 degrees,
millennia.
2 degrees over 10,000 years. And that gave us conditions in which our civilization could flourish. But then if you look at now, so you see a little arrow up there that says 2004, you can see that it's shot up. And of course, we're 10 years further in. So if I go to the next slide, this is the temperature change from 1880 up to the 2000. And you can see we're going from minus 0.6 degrees Celsius. Again, anomaly just means change, up to about 0.8 degrees Celsius. So from 1780 to now, we've already had a 1.1 degrees Celsius change in the temperature. That means the 2 degrees Celsius change we're talking about until 2100 means we only have 0.9 or about 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit left that we can go to before we exceed the limit. So after that, the global warming and climate change we're experiencing is going to get much worse than what we've seen so
Okay,
far.
my bad news is we have 5 minutes.
So then, natural gas is dirty energy. Okay, it's actually, if you release it into the air, it traps 86 times more heat than carbon dioxide over a period of 20 years. So it's far dirtier than carbon dioxide as far as a greenhouse gas. And the way these gas companies operate is there's lots of leakages. So this is a map of the leakages
Wow.
in the Northeast. And first of all, the scales that you see here are actually longitude and latitude. So if you look at the color scale on the bottom, on the right is 15. That means 15 kilograms per square meter that's being leaked. So in Connecticut, you can see that around Hartford, there's a lot of gas leakages.
This because of aging infrastructure?
Just because of distribution pipelines aging. And you can see down in New Haven, you can see New London off in the right-hand corner with the red spot there. And up there further, a little dot for Willimantic. But some of these are also infrastructure for the transmission gas lines. So there's compressor stations to keep the gas at high pressure. And they actually vent, besides leakages, they actually vent natural gas periodically out of these things. There is a metering and regulation station. They also vent natural gas from these things. You see the pipe going up, that's for venting natural gas.
And it's just dissipating and going up into the atmosphere.
Right. I mean, I've been to these places and you can smell the natural gas coming out of them. There's another metering station. And there's also health effects of these things. I'll skip over the health effects.
They're not good.
They're not good.
Okay.
But they also affect ecosystem services. So we're talking about animal habitat, so let's take a look at what that means. So this is trillion tons of biomass being lost here. So the left-hand scale is a trillion tons of biomass, and you can see we're going up to about 10 trillion tons of biomass being lost because of fracking. Okay. Without the leakages. This is just the land.
This is just the fracking.
This is just the land that's being destroyed by all these fracking wells. And you can see it's rangelands, croplands, forest lands, and wetlands. And there's some,
No.
yeah, so 415,000 animals a year are losing their forage because of this. And it's about 120 million bushels of wheat that are being lost that could be produced from this.
We have about a minute,
And,
so.
this is the stress on wells. So the stress on wells, and we're looking at 100,000 wells, so somewhere around 600,000, 800,000 wells are being stressed because of fracking and the amount of water it takes.
Now, since we only have maybe 30 seconds left, where can people go to find out more information about it or to get active in their own communities?
So if they can contact either one of us through our websites.
Okay, and it's Eastern CT greenaction.org or foodandwaterwatch.org. So they're
Exactly.
really easy
Yep.
URLs.
Really easy, yep.
And we will be putting this show up on YouTube so people can watch it again.
And we're willing to come out to any community and give a longer presentation and a more detailed explanation, and willing to talk to local officials, any commissions, church groups, any community event, really.
And how many communities is your goal, to get to ban fracking and fracking waste transmission in their local area? Are you trying to get the majority of towns in Connecticut, or?
We'd like to see Connecticut waste-free, absolutely.
Before the next legislative session in 2017, we like to see, at least 50, 60 towns ban fracking waste.
You're probably very busy then. But it does seem to be a huge issue that we're just now starting to see the impact of here, although I know other parts of the country have been living with the impacts for longer than we have been.
And there have been hundreds of local resolutions that have been passed around the country. Those are also chronicled on Food and Water Watch's website. You can just Google Food and Water Watch fracking local resolutions, and it'll bring you to a state-by-state listing that you can go through.
Well, thank you both for coming on to the show. I think you might have to come on again for updates and also to talk about some other energy alternatives that we should be looking at in our communities and going beyond oil and gas